We're doing all sorts of things, celebrating with family and friends, enjoying all the sights and the sounds that come with the season, and again, even comforting those who are struggling through the season. And that involves all the good stuff, right? Already had a couple of these. Cake, ice cream, get-togethers, songs, lights, pageants, parade. It's all great. It's all good stuff. But it all starts at the manger. It all starts here. And so that's what we remind ourselves when we come together in the midst of this season. Every Sunday when we gather, we're going to remind ourselves that it all starts here. And when it comes to the Bible and the story that the Bible is telling, it really does all start here in Matthew chapter 1. Matthew is the very first book in our New Testaments. Matthew's a letter that he writes a few years after Jesus has left and gone up to heaven. But Matthew starts it all off. And we talked a little bit last week. It all starts here. It all starts with the family tree of Jesus, the family history. It all starts with unlikely people, unworthy, undeserving, unexpected names in Jesus' family tree. One of Jesus' best friends, Matthew, is writing to a congregation much like our own. And they've got questions, and their questions are all around, is this really the guy? Is this really the one who was promised in the Old Testament? Is this really the one that we were supposed to be expecting? And Matthew's saying, oh yes it is. And here's why. And so he starts off with Jesus' family tree. Here's how he starts the story of Jesus' birth. An account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Jacob, Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, when Matthew, again, we talked a little bit about this last week, when Matthew includes these shady characters in Jesus' family tree, he is suggesting that these people aren't just a part of the story, they are the story. I mean, he ends the whole thing by saying, that when the angel talks to Joseph, that this baby that's coming is going to save his people from their sins. That's his mission. That's why Jesus comes down from heaven as a baby. To save his people from their sins. And so this is the story. Jesus doesn't come for the worthy, he comes for the unworthy, the undeserving. And so what we just read here, though, back up one. When he starts here, he starts with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And again, those are big names in Israel's history. Everybody, if you're a Jew and you live in that day, in fact, if you're Jewish, even today, you know those names. Because that's where it all starts. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Judah. There's a reason Judah is highlighted, because it's through Judah the promises were going to come. Now, Judah was one of Jacob's 12 sons. It says Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. If you want to include 11 in there, Judah and his 11 brothers. And we have their story in the book of Genesis here. And that story is not often a good one. In fact, for Judah's a rascal. Kind of like the rest of them. Judah's not the oldest, but the way it ends up, Judah ends up kind of being the ringleader of all of them as the story progresses. But Judah and his brothers, one of those 11 brothers is a brother, and he's quite younger. His name's Joseph. And the brothers don't like Joseph. Jacob, the dad, tends to favor Joseph. In fact, Genesis tells us that Joseph was his favorite son. And of course, you play favorites in a family, how do you think that's going to go over? Right? He favors Joseph. And so the other 11, they're not all that happy. And as the story goes in Genesis, Jacob sends Joseph to check in on the brothers. They're all shepherds. And he goes and he sees how the family business is doing. And he shows up, and they're angry at this point. They're angry enough to kill him. And through a series of events, they don't kill him. Judah actually ends up talking them into selling Joseph to some slave traders. So Judah is like, he comes off in the story as given the two options: kill Joseph or sell him into slavery. Oh yeah, that's a good thing. No, that's your brother. But anyway, Judah's the one who suggests, in order to save Joseph's life, hey, let's sell him to these slave traders, and he does. Then, of course, what are you going to tell Dad, right? And the story goes, they lie to Dad. They tell Dad this Joseph was attacked by a wild animal. They show him the coat that Jacob had given Joseph, and it's full of blood. And of course, they don't have DNA analysis back in those days. Animal got him. And so, Dad's all upset. But Judas, again, he's part of that. He's one of the ringleaders in telling Dad that story. And that brings us to this next story. You see, God had given all the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we get to these 12 sons, and these 12 sons aren't acting a whole lot like they're very interested in this promise, including Judah. And when we get to this one, we skip this chapter. We want to go to the story of Joseph. And anything about the story of Joseph, he also has his issues. Those slave traders end up in Egypt. But eventually he ends up on Egypt's throne after a few years. We want to go tell that story. But squeezed in between the story of Judah and the brothers selling Joseph as a slave trader and then tracking Joseph to Egypt is another story that we skip over. We might as well take Genesis 38 and just rip it out of our Bibles, because we don't cover it. Now, there's a couple of reasons why we don't cover it. Number one, the story itself, and we're going to track some of it today, gingerly. One of it is not safe for Sunday school. All right? It's one of those tales okay. We're just not going to cover this story. In fact, as I looked at this week, I can't remember the last time. I think maybe I've heard one sermon on Genesis 38. And it's because it's not safe for Sunday school. Well, and then the other thing. You're going to also pick up on this. We're going to talk a little bit about this. The way the whole thing is resolved, the way the whole sordid story is resolved, isn't to our liking. We don't like where this goes. And so if you've got a little bit of scandal, if you got something that's R-rated, and you don't like the ending, well, let's just get on with the Joseph story, okay? But if we do that, again, Matthew is sticking this squarely into the story of Jesus. He could have highlighted a whole bunch of other things going on in Jesus' family history. And again, as we looked at last week, women were not included in the family trees, but he includes 4, and one of them is Tamar. He goes out of his way to include her. Matthew's not skipping over that story. And so as we are in the midst of a season in which we kind of like all the fuzzy lights and the warm nativity scenes, this is part of that story. Here's how this all goes down. Judah's story in chapter 38 begins with the news that he has 3 sons. He's got 3 sons, and the custom was that he was supposed to get a wife for his firstborn son, and he does. These are, arranged marriages. Okay, so right away, all of a sudden, in our American... with our American sensibilities, and we got an arranged marriage, all of a sudden the story is starting to go off the rails, right? he finds a wife for this firstborn. We don't know what the firstborn does, but as the story progresses, we gather that this firstborn is dishonoring Jacob and dishonoring Judah and dishonoring the wife. And the scriptures say this son, his name is did evil in the sight of God. We're not told what did, just that he erred. And so, as the custom goes, it goes to the second son. And the second son's name is Onan. And so here's how it goes. Judah got a wife for the firstborn. Her name was Tamar. Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight. The Lord put him to death. Judah says to Onan then, sleep with your brother's wife. Perform your duty as her brother-in-law and produce offspring for your brother. All right, so now it's really getting weird. Right? Wife getting passed from one brother to another, but that was the custom and the culture in those days. And that also has something to do with the big storyline in the Old Testament. We're going to get to that. Perform your duty as her brother-in-law. Produce offspring for your brother. Onan does it. And I'll let you go to Genesis 38 to see what Onan does. That's the not safe. That's part of the not safe for Sunday school piece there. But what he does, Scripture says, was evil in the Lord's sight. And so he put him to death also. I mean, what Onan does is so obnoxious to God that God kills Onan. And the problem with Onan wasn't what he did necessarily, it's why he did it. Onan has no desire. He has no desire to carry on the family line through Tamar. He has no desire to participate in the promises. And if you haven't gotten the picture by now, as this story is progressing, those promises are coming through Judah. And those promises are coming through whoever marries Tamar. And these sons of Judah are having none of it. They're basically giving God the finger. We will not do this. We will not participate in the promises. And so God gives judgment to Onan. So now we're down to brother number 3. Now, if you're Judah and you're thinking, okay, God took the first one. God definitely took out the second one. We got a third son here. Now Tamar is the black widow, right? And that's how Judah is going to treat her. Here's what happens. Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house up until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he might die too, like his brothers. And my guess is Judah knows that Shelah probably is not all that on board with the promises either. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So, if we left everything right there, if we stopped the story right there, everything would be fine. Okay, we got family drama. We got family drama here. We got this wife that's being passed from brother to brother to die. And Judah is not about to have the third one die. And so he sends her home. Everything's okay. End of story, right? No. Judah wanted the story to be over. Tamar is back home with dad. And that's what Judah wants. But that's not where the story ends. Tamar, somehow, some way, and we get this from what follows, somehow, some way, Judah may be missing all of this. I don't think Judah is missing this, but he's still not on board. I think Tamar does. I think by this time, Tamar begins to understand that the promises of the Old Testament, including the promised one, that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Judah was going to come through her. Something special is going on with Tamar. And she may have heard the stories about Granddad Jacob, with the ladder and the angels in the sky. And Granddad Jacob wrestling with the angel. And the promises he received through those events. The angels and the ladder and the Lord of the ladder promising Jacob great prosperity through his family line. Grandpa has the promises, and she probably also heard the story of Rebekah, Jacob's mother. Rebekah, the one who also embraced the promises and experienced grief because of it. Maybe she, Tamar, begins to suspect that two of her husbands are dead because that son is coming through her. And here's what happens. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, dies. When Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went up to Timnah to his sheep shears. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So this is years later. She took off her widow's clothes, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance to Enim, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that, and here we go, though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Now that's an interesting tidbit. That's interesting. Go home to your father, I'll give you to Shelah when he's grown. What happens? Shelah grows up, and it never happens. The son of Judas, who was promised to her, was in fact, by their customs and arrangements, supposed to be her husband. And something again, Tamar seems to understand the promise is coming through her. Now Judah is also, like Onan, like abdicating his responsibility to the promise. Verse 12 tells us in the course of time, a lot of time had passed. We don't know whether Judah accidentally forgot or that he intentionally forgot, but Tamar hasn't forgotten. But she is stuck at her father's house. And Judah has ignored her. That's the other thing. Judah has ignored her. He's the one who's supposed to be taking care of her this whole time. And he pushes it back on her dad. And as we've just read, Tamar finds out Judah's headed to a party that's near her. Well, shearing sheep, that's a party, right? So she takes off the clothes. She'd been dressed like a widow. In those days, if you were a widow, people could tell immediately you were a widow by the way you dressed. And she did this for years. And now she puts on a veil, sits along the path on the entrance to the place her father-in-law, Judah, is going. Now you know where this is headed. You can tell where this is headed, right? This is also not safe for Sunday school. The rest of this chapter tells us that Judah sees a woman. He assumes that she is a prostitute. He doesn't recognize her, doesn't recognize her appearance, doesn't recognize her voice. Remember, this is years, right? This is years. He doesn't recognize any of it. So they start talking about what's going to transpire here, and they arrange for how much is this worth? The world's oldest profession, right? They settle on the price of a goat. Now, he didn't have a goat with him, so he gives a pledge. And his pledge is his staff and his signet ring, which, if you know anything about that culture, are two identity markers. That's like giving up your driver's license, your passport, your credit card. That's how you identify yourself. That's how you do business. So Judah's giving some significant items here. And he's all going to get it back when she gets the goat. Now Judah and her connect. He leaves this place, and she puts the widow clothes back on. And Judah keeps his end of the deal. He arranges for a goat to be sent back to where he just came from. Only word gets back to Judah that nobody can remember there ever being a prostitute around here. We don't know what you're talking about. She couldn't be found. The friend goes back to Judah. Judah, he's like, and again, this is the way the story goes in Genesis 38. He wants to drop the whole thing. We're going to keep this skeleton in this closet. I'm not going to go hunting for that staff. I'm not going to go hunting for that signet ring, even though those are my identity. Forget the ring, forget the staff. Let's just put this all behind us and under the rug. That skeleton is going to stay in the closet. But it doesn't. Here's where this goes. 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has been acting like a prostitute, and now she's pregnant. Bring her out, Judah said, and let her be burned to death. Yo, dude, wow. Self-righteous, aren't we? Really? You're going to go there? Judah's piling up the skeletons. He's been lying to his dad. He sells his brother into slavery, lies to his dad about it all, sleeping with a prostitute. Oh, by the way, lost the signet ring and the staff that are important to the family and its identity in the community. There's a lot of skeletons piling up here, Judah. That closet door is about to be flung open. As Tamar is being brought out, by the way, this is courtroom imagery here. As Tamar is being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message. I am pregnant by the man to whom these items belong. And she added, examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? Oh, probably could have heard a pin drop. Pregnant Tamar, being led out to face the charges. And she brings her own defense, and she's bringing evidence. Evidence that incriminates the accuser, who is also her judge. Judah himself. Judah's exposed, the lie is uncovered. Now, we come to this story, and if we were to stop right here, we have all sorts of assumptions. For one thing, again, as we follow this story, we recognize that this culture is a little different than our own, right? But we allow the storyteller to tell the story as it occurs, as he is witness to, as these people lived it. Tamar is pregnant. And she's pregnant with a child of destiny. Child of destiny. Tamar knows it, and if Judah doesn't know it, he certainly knows it by now. Here's Judah's response. Judah recognized them talking about the staff, the ring, the cord. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. You hear what he's saying? More righteous. It's not an accident that that word is used. Righteous, as we trace it throughout the Bible, has a lot of meaning. There's a lot of significance to that word. Being in the right. Right standing. And so Judah is in this moment, in the moment in which you can hear a pin drop, she is more righteous than I. More righteous. Judah, can you say that again, please? We didn't hear you. I think you're mumbling. More righteous. I didn't hear you, Judah. More righteous. Judah, you're not righteous at all. Tamar is the one who is righteous here. Tamar, the one who posed as a family prostitute in order to continue and propagate the family line. More righteous. And as this story continues, she's not pregnant with one, but two. They're twins here, and that's also a running theme in our Bibles. One of those is Perez. Perez, we just read it, is in Jesus' family line. Are you kidding me? Perez is the one through whom the promises to all of Israel will be fulfilled. Perez is the one through whom promises made to Adam and Eve in the garden will be fulfilled. That's grace. I mean, Perez is the kind of a child that you just want to bury and forget, right? This is the kind of thing that you hide and you hope nobody discovers. And yet here in Matthew 1, for everybody to see, an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Matthew's not just throwing it into the closet. He is breaking it wide open. Why? Because Perez is hope. If there's hope for Perez and Tamar, and yes, even Judah, there's hope for us, because the one who is coming here in Matthew is coming for them. He's coming to save sinners. Are you kidding me? And if we were to, again, this is also, we're not going to read it today, this is also a huge moment in Judah's life. Tamar saves Judah. Because after this moment, Judah begins acting like he's the one through whom the promises are coming. He begins acting like the one that was promised all along. In fact, we get to the end of Jacob's life, and Judah has the promise. A king is coming through you. A king for all nations is coming through you. And as the story continues, Judah himself is willing to sacrifice his own life for the life of his brother. Judah leaves this whole thing a changed man. Why? Because of Tamar. Because of God's grace. Because of God's forgiveness. All those skeletons in your closet, Judah, forgiven. Forgiven. Jesus came for Tamar. Jesus came for Judah. Forgiveness is never deserved. Ever. Forgiveness only ever comes to people who are unlikely, unworthy, undeserving. That's the story of Christmas. The great missionary Paul, we read it a few moments ago. The great missionary Paul once said this: while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For rarely will someone die for a just person, though for a good person, perhaps someone might even dare to die. But God proves his own love for us, in that while we were still like Tamar, when we were still like Judah, we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ came as a baby, grew up into adulthood, and then died for us. The gift that we need most this Christmas is the gift that we need every day of our lives, and that's forgiveness. Some of us here are carrying burdens that we were never meant to carry. Some of us here have not necessarily skeletons in the closet, but there's stuff we just don't like talking about. And Jesus came for all of that. He came as a baby. He lived and he died and he rose for all of that. Jesus and his forgiveness are the gifts we need this Christmas season. Just like Judah. Just like Tamar. Sinners. The unlikely, the unexpected, the unworthy, the undeserving. That's Tamar, that's Judah, that's me, that's you. And Christ is for all of us. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this reminder from your text, the story that we like to skip over. I pray that even this Christmas, that we will experience the same grace and the same forgiveness that you gave Tamar and you gave Judah. In your name I pray. Amen. You know, I said one of the reasons why we don't like telling that story isn't simply because it's unsafe for Sunday school, but because we don't like where that story goes. We live in a culture that is unforgiving. We read that story, again, in our culture, Genesis chapter 38, where do you think our fingers are going to be pointing? Who's going to be the one that we're thinking all judgmental about and getting all judgy with? Who's the one that saves Judah? Who's the one who is called more righteous? We don't tell that story because it looks too much like our own. Because we would have to do some admitting ourselves. We'd have to get honest with ourselves. And Christ's grace, Christ's forgiveness is for not just Tamar, but for me, for you. And that's what this is. Christ's broken body for the Tamars and Judahs of the world, me and you.